Welcome, wanderer, to a place where history drifts like candlelight through forgotten halls. Here, we linger in the quiet shadows of the past, where Babylon rose from river clay, where gardens floated above the desert, and where kings, scribes, and dreamers carved their stories into stone. This is not a place for hurried lessons or loud battles. It is a place for slow storytelling, for whispers of empires, and for the gentle unraveling of myths long buried beneath the sands. So rest your mind, let the ancient voices guide you, and drift into the soft glow of yesterday. You are listening to the Bedtime Sleepy Historian. The city of dust and gold. The city rose from the river. Babylon did not begin as an empire, or even as a dream of kings. It began as dust clinging to sandals, as reeds cut along the Euphrates, as clay bricks pressed by calloused hands and left to dry under a relentless sun. The Euphrates curled lazily through the Mesopotamian plain, a brown ribbon of water feeding fields of barley and date palms. On its banks, men stacked mud brick upon mud brick, until huts became houses, and houses clustered into villages, and villages swelled into a city whose name, Babilu, meant the gate of the gods. To the early dwellers, the city seemed to grow like a living thing. Its streets were narrow and crooked, filled with donkeys and traders, children running barefoot, and priests in long linen robes carrying offerings to shrines of clay and wood. At dawn, incense rose from small altars as women whispered prayers to Ishtar for fertility, or to Marduk for protection. The air smelled of fish from the river, of bread baked in clay ovens, and of bitumen, tar, that sealed the city's walls. In those first centuries, Babylon was not yet the mighty jewel of the ancient world. It was a modest town in the shadow of larger powers, Akkad, Ur, Assyria. Yet there was something about its placement, something about the wealth of its soil and the stubbornness of its people, that gave it a different destiny. Farmers here reaped barley enough to brew beer for the workers, and the river gave fish enough to feed an army. Roads stretched outward, carrying caravans of lapis lazuli, copper, and wool. Babylon became a place of exchange, a marketplace where foreign tongues mingled like threads woven into a tapestry. The first walls were simple, more ceremonial than defensive, but their presence declared ambition. This was a city that intended to last. At night the people gathered on rooftops, watching the stars turn across the velvet sky. The priests whispered that the heavens themselves had a pattern, that the gods had written their will into the stars. Perhaps it was this early sense of destiny written above, that planted the seed of Babylon's rise. It was still fragile, of course. A flood could ruin harvests, a stronger neighbor could march in, a king's whim could shatter years of peace. And yet Babylon endured. Through dust, through heat, through centuries of toil, it endured. In time, it would not only endure, it would rise to command the rivers, the deserts, and the empires around it. But that, as the elders sitting in the shade of the temple liked to say, was a story written on clay tablets yet to be baked. Hammurabi and the Code of Kings. Babylon's true ascent began with one man, Hammurabi. He was not the first ruler of Babylon, nor would he be its last, but under his reign, the city leapt from a provincial town to the beating heart of Mesopotamia. He came to power in the early 18th century BC, inheriting a kingdom hemmed in by rivals. To the north lay Assyria, fierce and ambitious. To the south, the old Sumerian cities of Ur and Larsa still clung to their fading glory. To survive, Hammurabi would need more than strength. He would need patience, cunning, and an unshakable vision. At first, he played the diplomat. He sent gifts to neighboring kings, sealed alliances with careful words, and waited. But while he smiled, he built. Irrigation canals stretched like veins across the countryside, feeding fields that yielded enough grain to feed not only the city but armies. Temples rose higher, adorned with carvings that honored Marduk, Babylon's patron god. And quietly, Hammurabi trained his soldiers, drilling them in formations that would soon march beyond Babylon's walls. When the moment came, it came like a storm. Hammurabi struck at his rivals one by one, toppling them with speed and precision. Larsa fell. Mari fell. The proud cities of Sumer bent their necks. Within decades, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates, the cradle of civilization itself, was his. Babylon was no longer a name on a clay tablet. It was the capital of an empire. But Hammurabi understood that conquest alone would not hold it. Armies could force obedience, but only laws could create unity. And so, he gathered the scribes and priests and crafted what would become his greatest legacy, the Code of Hammurabi. Carved into a black stele of basalt, its surface etched with 282 laws, the code was displayed in the heart of Babylon for all to see. It was not gentle. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Such was its spirit. If a builder's house collapsed and killed the owner, the builder's own life was forfeit. If a son struck his father, his hands would be cut off. Yet within its severity lay order. Contracts were written, debts recorded, marriages bound by law. The weak, Hammurabi declared, must be protected from the strong. Justice, though harsh, would be predictable. Citizens gathered before the great stele, tracing the carved letters with their fingers, murmuring the laws aloud. For the first time, a people spread across deserts and rivers were bound not only by the will of their king, but by a common rule, a shared understanding of justice. From this stone, Babylon's fame spread outward. Traders spoke of its laws in far-off markets, and kings in distant cities measured themselves against Hammurabi's order. The Gate of the Gods was no longer merely a trading town, it was the seat of a civilization, a city where kings claimed the mandate of heaven, and where justice itself had been carved into stone. And yet, as the river flowed on and centuries turned, even Hammurabi's laws could not protect Babylon from the tides of time. Empires rose and fell like waves against its walls, and Babylon, though glorious, would learn that even stone wears down under centuries of storms. The splendor of the city. After Hammurabi, Babylon passed through hands both strong and weak, rising and falling like the tides of the Euphrates. For a time, its brilliance dimmed, eclipsed by Assyria to the north. Yet Babylon, like the river that fed it, never truly dried. It waited quietly until the day it would blaze brighter than any city on earth. That day came centuries later, under the rule of Nebuchadnezzar II. If Hammurabi gave Babylon its laws, Nebuchadnezzar gave it its splendor. He was a builder king, restless in his ambition, determined to transform the city into the jewel of the ancient world. The walls rose first. Towering ramparts encircled the city, so vast that legend claimed chariots could race upon their tops. Gleaming with glazed brick, they caught the sunlight by day and flickered like embers by torchlight at night. To enter Babylon, one passed through the Ishtar Gate, a colossal arch of deep blue, adorned with lions, bulls, and dragons, symbols of power, guardians of the gods. Travelers who walked beneath its arches often stopped in awe, whispering that they had never seen such colors, such majesty. Inside, the city teemed with life. Merchants led caravans heavy with spices, lapis, and timber. Scribes hunched over clay tablets, pressing words of law, trade, and poetry into wet clay. Priests led processions through the streets, carrying statues of gods swathed in linen and gold. The air was thick with incense, laughter, and the rhythmic beat of drums. And at the city's heart rose the ziggurat of Etemenanke, a colossal step-tower dedicated to Marduk. Its name meant, the foundation of heaven and earth, and from a distance it seemed to touch the sky itself. Some would later tell stories of this tower, twisting it into the tale of Babel, a monument to human pride. But to the Babylonians, it was a sacred ladder between earth and the divine, a place where priests could ascend to meet the gods. Then there were the gardens, if they truly existed. Ancient writers speak of terraces overflowing with greenery, trees spilling their shade down tiered steps, streams flowing from hidden aqueducts. The hanging gardens of Babylon, they called them, a wonder of the world. Built, it was said, for Nebuchadnezzar's queen, who longed for the mountains of her homeland. Whether myth or truth, the image endured Babylon as a place where even the desert bloomed. From its gates to its temples, Babylon shone like no other city. Poets of foreign lands spoke its name with reverence. Traders carried tales of its grandeur as far as Egypt, Greece, and beyond. To live in Babylon was to walk in a place where stone and clay aspired to eternity, where the gods themselves seemed to dwell among mortals. And yet, beneath the splendor, there was always the shadow of time. For just as rivers flood and recede, so too do empires. Even Babylon's beauty could not shield it forever from the ambition of rival kings, nor from the relentless march of history. The fall to Persia. Babylon's greatness, dazzling though it was, lived always under the same sky that oversaw the ruin of every city before it. No wall was high enough to halt the passing of empires, no gate strong enough to lock out ambition. In the 6th century BC, Babylon stood tall, but to the east, a new power was stirring, the Persians. Cyrus the Great, a ruler of vision and strategy, was uniting lands and peoples beneath his expanding dominion. His armies swept across the Near East like a tide, not only conquering but incorporating, offering a kind of empire that promised order and respect for local traditions. Babylon, proud and ancient, soon found itself in his path. The fall, when it came, was strange, not the clash of fire and ruin that one might expect, but a quieter undoing. In 539 BC, the Euphrates was diverted. Cyrus's men, clever in their engineering, channeled the river's waters into trenches, lowering its flow until they could march directly along the riverbed, slipping beneath Babylon's mighty walls. The city gates, it is said, were left unbarred that night. Whether through negligence, betrayal, or sheer disbelief that Babylon could be breached, the defenses that had awed the world were useless. Cyrus entered without resistance, greeted not with cries of war but with silence. Some accounts claim the people even welcomed him, weary of their king, Nabonidus, whose eccentric devotion to the moon god Sin had estranged priests and citizens alike. Thus, the city of Hammurabi and Nebuchadnezzar fell, not in fire but in surrender. Babylon, the dazzling heart of Mesopotamia, became a jewel in the Persian crown. Its gods were honored, its temples maintained, but its independence was gone. The lion had been caged. Yet Babylon did not vanish. For centuries, under Persian, then Macedonian, then Seleucid rule, the city remained a place of learning, trade, and culture. Alexander the Great himself dreamed of making it his capital. He died there, in a palace along the Euphrates, his body guarded by the very walls that had once defied the world. But decline had begun. Trade routes shifted. Power drifted westward to new centers. By the time Rome rose, Babylon was fading, its gardens withering, its ziggurats crumbling back into clay. What had once been the world's most brilliant city slowly dissolved into memory and dust. Travelers centuries later would stand amid its ruins, staring at mounds of broken brick and reeds sprouting where palaces once stood. Some would carry away tales, and some myths. Babylon lived on in scripture and story, as a symbol of grandeur, of arrogance, of splendor brought low. Even in ruins, the city never ceased to whisper. Its name carried echoes of triumph and warning, a reminder that even the mightiest walls cannot outlast the passage of time. A gentle reflection. And so Babylon passes, not in flames but in silence, slipping from a living city into a story. Its towers of brick, once reaching toward the heavens, softened into clay. Its gates of bronze, once open to kings, rusted in the earth. Its gardens, whether real or imagined, withered away until only words carried their fragrance. Yet the city's spirit lingers, not only in ruins half buried beneath desert sands, but in language, law, and legend. We still measure hours by the divisions Babylonians taught us. We still read the stars through patterns they first charted. We still wrestle with the stories they left, stories of gods, of towers, of kings who thought themselves eternal. Babylon reminds us of something simple and quiet, that all things rise, and all things fall, but nothing is ever truly lost. The clay of one age becomes the foundation of the next. The whispers of an empire linger long after its banners have been lowered. As you rest now, you might imagine the Euphrates flowing under moonlight, carrying with it the reflections of vanished walls. Perhaps you hear distant voices, scribes pressing wedges into wet clay, priests chanting before an altar, merchants calling out beneath the arches of Ishtar's gate. They are gone, but not entirely. They live in memory, in story, in the timeless rhythm of history itself. So close your eyes, and let the ruins of Babylon fade into dreams. For like that ancient city, we too are part of the long, unbroken tale of humanity, brief sparks in the dark, glowing for a time before becoming stories whispered to those who come after. Echoes beyond the ruins. Yet even as Babylon crumbled, the name endured. For centuries after its fall, poets and prophets used it as a symbol. To some, it became a word for pride, for decadence, for the danger of believing a city could outlast time itself. To others, it was a marvel, a place that stirred longing for what had been lost. In scriptures, Babylon appears as both a warning and a mystery. Its downfall became a story told again and again, not as history, but as parable. In the minds of the faithful, Babylon was not simply bricks and mortar, but an idea, the hubris of kings, the fragility of power, the fleeting shimmer of glory. Travelers wandered the plains where it once stood, scratching their names into broken walls, carrying away fragments of brick as tokens. Alexander the Great, in the flush of his conquest, dreamed of making Babylon the capital of his empire. He walked its streets, already cracked and fading, and imagined them restored to brilliance. But even he, with all his ambition, could not awaken it. His death in the city was a reminder that not even conquerors can hold back the slow drift of time. And yet Babylon still lives. Its name passes from tongue to tongue, finding its way into songs, stories, and even the stars. When you hear it, you don't picture dust, but greatness, the shimmer of torchlight on brick, the grandeur of gates painted with lions, the murmurs of priests beneath the heavens. Babylon is gone, yes. But in vanishing, it became eternal. The weight of kings. To walk through Babylon in its height would have been to feel the presence of kings in every stone. Nebuchadnezzar, too, the ruler who rebuilt much of the city, left his mark in the very bricks, his name stamped into clay, repeated so many times that future diggers found themselves surrounded by his voice in baked earth. For him, Babylon was not merely a capital, but a vision. He ordered gardens that reached the heavens, temples taller than palaces, and walls so broad that chariots could race upon them. Each command was an echo of his belief that kingship meant bending stone and labor to reflect divine favor. And yet, that same grandeur carried weight. The people whispered about taxes that drained their purses, about forced labor that tired their arms, about a city always demanding more from those who lived beneath its towers. For the common Babylonians, the king was both protector and burden. They watched his parades with awe, the glitter of gold, the processions of gods carried on men's shoulders. But when the festivals ended, their daily lives returned, grinding grain, fetching water, patching sandals, raising children in the shadow of monuments that were not theirs. The kings of Babylon carried crowns heavy with expectation. They were judged by gods and subjects alike. A failed harvest could tarnish their divinity, a lost war could unravel their authority. And so, each king lived with urgency, striving to leave behind something that would outlast him. But in that very striving lay the seed of decline. For no matter how high the walls, or how grand the towers, time would remind them that kings fall just as cities do. The rhythm of daily life. Step away from the palaces and temples, and Babylon reveals another face, the hum of its streets. The city was alive with tradesmen calling their wares, the shuffle of sandals on packed earth, the scent of dates and onions carried on the dry air. Merchants set up stalls beneath awnings of cloth, shouting prices for barley, figs, fish brought from the Euphrates, and wool dyed in colors that caught the sunlight. Scribes sat with their reed pens and clay tablets, offering to record debts, contracts, or even letters for those who could not write. Children darted between adults, chasing each other with pebbles or scraps of string, while women bargained loudly, their voices strong as they pressed sellers for better prices. At dawn, workers left their homes of mud brick, heading toward fields or construction sites, their tools slung over shoulders. Others joined the bustling workshops, bronze smiths hammering sparks from metal, potters shaping clay with steady hands, carpenters cutting cedar into beams for palaces. Every sound wove into a single rhythm, the heartbeat of Babylon. Homes were small, built close together with flat rooftops where families often slept in the open air, especially in the sweltering summer nights. Neighbors leaned across walls to gossip, and water carriers trudged through alleys with heavy jars. At night, oil lamps flickered in windows, while in taverns beer flowed thick and sweet, served in large clay jars from which drinkers sipped through long reeds. Amid the grandeur of kings and temples, Babylon's lifeblood was here, in these markets, alleys, and humble homes. For it was the rhythm of ordinary lives, repeated day after day, that kept the great city standing. The Hanging Gardens, a dream in stone and green. Among all the marvels whispered about Babylon, none has captured the imagination more than the Hanging Gardens. Whether they truly existed or were born from later storytelling, their legend was so powerful it still blooms in our minds. Ancient writers spoke of terraced gardens that rose like a mountain inside the city walls, draped in lush greenery, a wonder that seemed impossible in the arid Mesopotamian plain. According to tradition, King Nebuchadnezzar too built them for his queen, Amytas of Media, who longed for the cool hills and forests of her homeland. To ease her homesickness, the king ordered an artificial mountain constructed, layer upon layer of stone terraces, each watered by ingenious systems of irrigation. From a distance, they said, the gardens seemed to float in the air, a cascade of vines, palms, and fragrant flowers spilling down their steps. Imagine walking beneath their shade. The air, heavy with heat, suddenly cools as water trickles from hidden channels. The scent of cedar and myrtle drifts past, mingling with jasmine and figs. Birds nest in the branches, and soft shadows fall across the stone paths. For Babylonians used to dust and sun, it must have seemed a glimpse of paradise itself. Engineers puzzled for centuries over how such gardens could survive in a desert city. Some claimed that Archimedean screws, turned by hand or beasts, lifted water from the Euphrates into reservoirs above. Others doubted the gardens existed at all, noting that Babylonian records, so thorough in other matters, never mention them. Perhaps they were a poetic embellishment, inspired by other gardens of Mesopotamian kings. Yet, whether myth or truth, the legend of the Hanging Gardens became inseparable from Babylon. It symbolized not just royal love, but the city's audacity, to bend stone, water, and earth into a vision that defied its harsh climate. Omens, stars, and the will of the gods. To live in Babylon was to live under the gaze of the gods. Every decision, every harvest, every battle was thought to hinge upon divine favor. Priests, astronomers, and scribes worked tirelessly to interpret the signs scattered across the heavens and the earth. The Babylonians believed the gods spoke in subtle ways, through the flight of birds, the livers of sacrificed sheep, the shape of clouds, even the cracks in a clay tablet baked too long in the kiln. But most of all, they looked upward, to the stars. High atop ziggurats, priests known as Baru or Yuparinima Anu in Lil spent nights charting the sky. They mapped the movements of Venus, Jupiter, and Mars, searching for patterns. A bright star rising in the east could foretell a king's triumph. A lunar eclipse might warn of danger to the throne. These observations, gathered over centuries, became some of the earliest forms of astronomy, yet to the Babylonians, they were not science but sacred communication. Ordinary citizens, too, sought guidance from omens. Before a journey, one might toss handfuls of oil onto water and watch the ripples. Before a marriage, families consulted diviners to know whether the union pleased the gods. Even merchants hesitated to sail the Euphrates if the stars were unkind. In the temples, statues of gods such as Marduk or Ishtar were not mere symbols but living presences. Priests washed and clothed these figures daily, offering meals of bread, dates, and beer. If a god seemed angry, if crops failed or sickness spread, elaborate rituals were performed to soothe divine wrath. For the people of Babylon, fate was never random. It was written in the heavens, inscribed in clay, and whispered by unseen forces. Life became a constant negotiation with the gods, prayers, offerings, sacrifices, all attempts to keep the cosmic balance in their favor. And in this delicate dance between humans and divinity, Babylon's identity was shaped, a city of dreamers who. Nebuchadnezzar and the zenith of Babylon. The name that still echoes most loudly across the centuries of Babylon's history is that of King Nebuchadnezzar II. To the people of his time, he was not merely a ruler, he was the chosen shepherd of Marduk, the earthly executor of the god's will. To later empires, he became a figure of both awe and dread. His reign, beginning in 605 BC, marked the true zenith of Babylon's power. When Nebuchadnezzar ascended the throne, Babylon was already a rising star. Yet under his hand, it became the unrivaled center of the known world. He was a warrior king, relentless in his campaigns. From the Levant to the gates of Egypt, his armies marched with bronze and iron, their banners glinting in the desert sun. Cities that defied him were reduced to rubble. Those that yielded swore allegiance and sent tribute back to Babylon. One of his most famous conquests was the capture of Jerusalem. Babylonian soldiers stormed the city, and from its holy temple, treasures were carried away. The Jewish elite were taken into exile, beginning the Babylonian captivity, a chapter that would reverberate deeply through the cultural memory of a people. For Nebuchadnezzar, this was more than war. It was a demonstration that even distant gods could not resist the will of Marduk's chosen king. But Nebuchadnezzar was not only a destroyer. He was also a builder. The Babylon he ruled over blossomed with unprecedented grandeur. Temples rose higher, walls were strengthened, and the fabled Ishtar Gate was erected, adorned with glazed blue bricks and mythical beasts of dazzling brilliance. To enter through that gate was to step into a city that seemed to hum with divine favor. Chroniclers wrote of Nebuchadnezzar's pride in his projects, of how he inscribed his name upon bricks to remind future generations of his hand in their making. To him, construction was as much a form of conquest as battle, an act of shaping the world in his image. Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar was both feared abroad and celebrated at home, a city whose splendor made visitors stumble in awe. Yet behind the glittering facades, the fate of empires remained fragile, for even the mightiest ziggurat could not reach high enough to hold back the turning of history's wheel. The Hanging Gardens, wonder or myth? No tale of Babylon can escape the pull of the Hanging Gardens, that elusive wonder said to have risen like a mountain of greenery in the heart of the city. Ancient writers described terraces of lush plants, watered by ingenious systems of pulleys and hidden channels, a man-made Eden where fruit trees bent heavy with gifts above the city streets. The air, they claimed, was fragrant with blossoms, a sharp contrast to the dry Mesopotamian winds. According to tradition, the gardens were built by Nebuchadnezzar himself, a gesture of devotion to his queen, Amytis of Media. She had grown up in a land of rolling green hills and longed for the sight of mountains cloaked in vegetation. To ease her sorrow, the king ordered stone terraces stacked one upon the other, creating the illusion of her native landscapes. On these terraces, soil was heaped deep enough to sustain trees, and beneath them, hidden mechanisms lifted water from the Euphrates to nourish the roots. Greek historians like Strabo and Diodorus Siculus wrote of these gardens with wonder centuries later. Yet the question lingers, did they truly exist, or were they the dream of foreign travelers enchanted by the thought of paradise in the desert? Archaeologists have long sought their remains in Babylon's ruins, but no definitive evidence has been found. Some scholars suggest that the gardens may never have been in Babylon at all, but rather in Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, misattributed through the muddle of history. Others argue that the absence of ruins does not erase the possibility that mud brick, water, and vegetation simply left no lasting trace. Whether myth or reality, the legend of the Hanging Gardens endures because it captures a deeper truth about Babylon. The city was not only about conquest or power. It was also about beauty, about creating spaces where the human heart could rest in delight. Just as the ziggurat stretched toward heaven, so too the gardens symbolized humanity's yearning to bring heaven down to earth. Thus, the Hanging Gardens remained suspended in that fragile space between fact and imagination, a wonder that may never have existed, and yet, in memory, will never disappear. A city of trade and learning. Babylon's strength was not only measured in its walls and temples but in the hum of its markets, and the scratch of its scribes' reeds. The city stood at the crossroads of Mesopotamia, where caravan routes from the east met river traffic from the west. Camels laden with spices, textiles, and gems trudged through its gates, while barges heavy with grain, dates, and bitumen floated down the Euphrates. The market squares were a kaleidoscope of sound and color. Merchants from far-off lands spoke in tongues that mingled like music in the air: Persian, Aramaic, Elamite, even the distant accents of traders from India. Stalls offered copper from Cyprus, ivory from Africa, and rare woods from the Levant. Babylon's prosperity made it a magnet for goods and people alike, and in its streets one could feel the pulse of half the world. But Babylon was more than a hub of commerce, it was a cradle of knowledge. Scribes, trained from youth, bent over clay tablets pressed with cuneiform wedges. They recorded not just contracts and inventories, but hymns to gods, lists of stars, and calculations of the heavens. Astronomy, in particular, flourished here. Babylonian scholars charted the movements of the planets, predicting eclipses with uncanny accuracy. To them, the sky was not only a scientific frontier but a divine text, each star a sign written by the gods. In the shadow of Asagil's towering ziggurat, priests interpreted omens, reading the flight of birds, the patterns in oil poured on water, even the livers of sacrificed animals. Kings and generals relied on these prophecies before taking action, binding science and religion into a single worldview. The lines between mathematics and mysticism blurred in Babylon, where calculation and devotion walked hand in hand. Education itself was rigorous. A young boy entering the scribal schools, tablet houses, faced long hours of memorizing signs, copying proverbs, and practicing accounts. Many gave up, but those who endured became part of the elite who managed the lifeblood of the city, its records. Without scribes, trade could not flourish, taxes could not be collected, and temples could not honor their gods with precision. Thus, Babylon was not merely a place of bricks and gardens. It was a living mind, a city whose intellect rivaled its architecture, where knowledge was hoarded and shared, where learning was considered a sacred duty. After Nebuchadnezzar, the cracks appear. When Nebuchadnezzar II died in 562 BC, Babylon stood at the height of its glory. Its walls shone white in the sun, its temples hummed with ritual, its markets overflowed with wealth. But like many great cities, its brilliance masked the fractures beneath. The successors of Nebuchadnezzar lacked his strength of will and vision. His son, Marduk, inherited the throne but not the loyalty of the priests or nobility. His rule was brief, ending in assassination after just 2 years. Behind palace doors, intrigue became the new order of the day. Generals, nobles, and priests wrestled for influence, each faction pulling in a different direction, leaving the once stable empire wobbling. One of the gravest problems lay in Babylon's own success. To maintain the splendor of its temples, gardens, and fortifications, enormous sums of silver and grain were demanded from the people. Farmers bore heavy taxes, merchants grew weary of tribute, and subject cities began to grumble under Babylon's dominance. What had been a proud center of empire was, in the eyes of many vassals, a golden cage from which they longed to escape. At the same time, the world beyond Babylon shifted. In the east, a new power was stirring, the Persians, led by the ambitious Cyrus the Great. His empire expanded rapidly, swallowing kingdoms that once bowed to Babylon. Where Nebuchadnezzar had ruled with iron and grandeur, his successors quarreled and faltered, leaving the city vulnerable to forces gathering at its gates. Religion too became a point of contention. The priests of Marduk, the city's chief god, demanded reverence and resources above all else. Yet not all Babylonians agreed, and subject peoples with their own deities felt alienated by the city's dominance. Unity, which once held Babylon strong, began to unravel. Still, the city's outward magnificence continued. Its markets bustled, its scholars wrote, its walls stood tall. But beneath the sound of commerce and the chants of priests, there was a quieter murmur, a sense that Babylon, like a great lamp, was burning too brightly, consuming too much oil, and might one day flicker. The fall without a battle. In 539 BC, as the autumn wind stirred the plains of Mesopotamia, the armies of Cyrus the Great marched toward Babylon. By then, the city was still majestic, its walls as tall as towers and its gates clad in bronze, but inside, the empire had grown brittle. Factional quarrels weakened the court, taxes weighed heavily on the common people, and many subject nations no longer felt loyalty to the Babylonian crown. The story of Babylon's fall is remarkable not for the clash of steel, but for the absence of it. Ancient chronicles, most famously the Cyrus Cylinder and later accounts by Herodotus, speak of how the Persians diverted the Euphrates River that ran through the city. By lowering the water level, Cyrus' men were able to march beneath Babylon's walls along the dry riverbed. Guards, weary and inattentive, failed to sound the alarm. In some versions of the tale, the Babylonians were so confident in their fortifications that they continued with a great festival as the Persians entered. Wine flowed, torches burned, and music filled the streets, even as the empire's fate shifted. By morning, Babylon belonged to Persia. The transition was swift, and for many, surprisingly merciful. Cyrus presented himself not as a conqueror but as a restorer of order. He honored Marduk, Babylon's chief god, and returned many captured peoples to their homelands, including the Jews exiled in Babylon after the destruction of Jerusalem's temple. His propaganda cast him as a liberator, chosen by the gods to bring peace. For Babylon's citizens, the shift was unsettling yet oddly quiet. Markets reopened, priests performed their rituals, scribes still inscribed tablets in cuneiform. But the spirit of independence was gone. No longer the proud heart of an empire, Babylon became a jewel in the Persian crown, a place of culture and wealth, yes, but one whose destiny was now tied to rulers far beyond its walls. The fall of Babylon was not a dramatic blaze but a slow dimming, like a lamp burning low. The city that once towered over the world was conquered not by destruction, but by cleverness, timing, and its own weariness. Babylon under Persian rule. When Babylon awoke under Persian banners, its people found that life, for the most part, went on as before. The great markets still opened each morning, merchants still haggled beneath striped awnings, and scribes still hunched over clay tablets, etching contracts, letters, and ledgers into neat rows of cuneiform. But beneath the familiar rhythms, a quiet change had taken root. The city no longer ruled, it was ruled. Decisions that once radiated outward from the throne of Babylon were now filtered through distant Susa and Persepolis. Tax collectors bore new seals, messengers carried orders in Aramaic, the lingua franca of the Persian Empire, and the once proud kings of Babylon had been replaced by satraps, governors who answered to the great king. Yet Cyrus and his successors were careful. They did not strip Babylon of its dignity outright. Instead, they honored its gods and restored its temples, understanding that to win Babylon's loyalty, one had to respect its pride. The priests of Marduk continued to chant their hymns, the great New Year festival still wound through the streets, and offerings of incense still rose from the towering ziggurats. In a sense, Babylon became a city of two worlds, still dazzling, still sacred, but now folded into an empire so vast that Babylon was but one star in its constellation. Traders brought Persian textiles, Indian gems, and Greek pottery into its markets. Its role shifted from sovereign to crossroads, from empire to hub. But with each passing decade, the center of power moved further away. Royal scribes who once chronicled the victories of Babylonian kings now recorded decrees issued by foreign rulers. The clay tablets began to thin out. The language of empires shifted. The very script that had captured the first laws and poems of humanity was slowly giving way. For ordinary people, these changes came like the slow turning of seasons. Farmers still sowed barley, brewers still filled jars with frothy beer, women still gathered to bake bread in clay ovens. Yet the old pride, the fierce knowledge that Babylon had once been the navel of the world, began to soften into memory. The Persians ruled lightly, but they ruled nonetheless. And Babylon, though still a city of wonders, was no longer the city of kings. Alexander's dream of Babylon continued. The city, weary of Persian rule, welcomed him as a liberator. Processions filled the avenues, priests of Marduk offered blessings, and Alexander walked the very processional way once trodden by Nebuchadnezzar. He entered the temple of Esagila with solemn respect, laying rich offerings before the god. To Alexander, Babylon was not merely another prize of conquest. It was a symbol, a jewel of the world. He dreamed of making it the capital of his empire, a meeting point of Greek and Mesopotamian thought, East and West united. Plans were drawn for canals, for the restoration of temples, for new palaces that would surpass even those of Nebuchadnezzar. He summoned engineers to drain the Euphrates marshes, and architects to design new structures that would honor both Hellenic and Babylonian traditions. Scholars gathered in its libraries once more, translating texts into Greek, comparing myths, and sharing knowledge of stars and medicine. Babylon, under Alexander, seemed poised for another age of brilliance. But fate cut short the dream. In 323 BC, amid the heat of summer, Alexander fell ill in Babylon's palace. He was only 32. Rumors spread like wildfire. Was it poison, or fever brought on by exhaustion? He died without a clear heir, and his generals carved the empire into pieces. Babylon, once more, became a prize in the quarrels of ambitious men. The city endured, but the fire of Alexander's dream flickered out, leaving only what-ifs in the dust of history. The long decline. After Alexander's death, Babylon's fate was sealed not with a single blow, but with centuries of slow unraveling. His generals, the Diadochi, fought bitterly for control of his empire. Babylon changed hands more than once, enduring sieges, betrayals, and occupations. The city that had once drawn the wealth of the world became a battlefield for men who sought only their share of power. The Seleucids, successors to Alexander in the east, eventually abandoned Babylon in favor of a new capital, Seleucia on the Tigris. It was a calculated insult as much as a practical decision. The shifting river channels and the decay of irrigation had already made Babylon harder to sustain. Seleucia, built on fresh ground, offered new possibilities. Babylon was left to wither. Still, life clung to its ruins. Farmers planted date palms among the fallen bricks. Priests of Marduk carried on their rituals as long as they could, chanting before crumbling altars, their voices echoing through half-empty halls. Astronomers still recorded the movements of the stars, scratching clay tablets in lonely chambers of the ziggurat. But their numbers dwindled. By the time the Parthians controlled Mesopotamia, Babylon was a shadow of itself. Travelers described a city half-deserted, its once mighty walls broken, its streets swallowed by weeds. The Greek historian Strabo, writing in the 1st century BC, spoke of Babylon as a great desert, where only scattered houses stood amid the ruins. Even so, the memory lingered. When the Romans dreamed of Eastern conquest, they still whispered of Babylon. When Jewish exiles told their children of the rivers where they had once wept, they named Babylon. The city had become both real and mythical, a ruin in the desert and a symbol in the imagination. It was a slow fade, not a sudden collapse, an empire reduced to echoes, until even the echoes began to die away. Silence among the ruins. By the time Rome rose to dominance, Babylon was no longer a living city but a memory scattered across the plain. Travelers reported seeing walls so wide that 4 horse-drawn chariots could once ride abreast upon them, yet now they lay cracked and hollow, echoing only with the wind. The great ziggurat of Etemenanke, the Tower of Babel of later lore, was little more than a jagged mound. The temples of Ishtar and Marduk, once lit by sacred fires, had fallen into disrepair. Priests had departed generations earlier, their chants forgotten by the dust. The canals that had once made the land bloom now choked with reeds, their waters stagnant. Yet the ruins still drew wonder. Roman generals, passing through Mesopotamia on campaigns, paused to marvel at the vastness of the walls, the strange silence of the place. Even in decay, Babylon seemed larger than imagination. Writers back in Rome and Greece spoke of it with awe, weaving stories that were half fact, half dream. The local villagers avoided the ruins at night, whispering that spirits wandered there. Some claimed to hear faint music drifting from broken halls, or to see lanterns glowing where no one lived. To them, the city was still alive, though in a way mortals could not quite enter. The name Babylon lingered in scripture, in poetry, in warnings and prophecies. It became more than a city, it was a symbol of pride, of sin, of empire, of fall. A city that had once ruled the known world was now a ruin on the plain, but its ghost would travel further than its armies ever had. Babylon in memory and legend. Long after its bricks crumbled, Babylon lived on in the stories humanity told itself. The city, whose name once meant Gate of the Gods, became instead a warning, a tale of ambition stretched too high, of towers built too close to the heavens, of kings who believed themselves immortal. For the Jews exiled there, Babylon became the city of sorrow, etched into psalms sung beside strange rivers. For Christians of later centuries, it was painted as a place of corruption and downfall, a symbol of arrogance punished by divine will. To poets and travelers of the Islamic Golden Age, it lingered as a site of marvels, a city of gardens and wonders now cloaked in silence. And in the imagination of Europe, it became the Tower of Babel, the moment when human pride shattered into many tongues. And yet, despite the curses, the prophecies, the legends, there is tenderness too. For Babylon was not only a city of pride and conquest, it was a place where people lived and loved, where farmers tilled fertile soil, where scribes pressed reeds into clay to hold the first words of history. It was a place where children grew beneath the shadow of mighty walls, where lovers walked through gardens perfumed with roses, where prayers rose with incense toward the night sky. Today, Babylon rests beneath the sun of Iraq, its walls eroded, its streets faint lines in the earth. The Euphrates still flows, patient and eternal, as if keeping the city's memory alive. Tourists walk its ruins, tracing bricks that once bore the name of kings. Scholars sift the soil, piecing together fragments of tablets, trying to hear the voices of those long gone. In the end, Babylon fell as all empires do. But unlike many, it never truly vanished. It transformed into something greater than stone, a story that endures, whispered in prayers, sung in psalms, invoked in myths, remembered in history.